Hi, thanks for joining me on another Bible talk. Now, this talk, it's called Joel Osteen's talk, Miracle of Endurance. Now, I was watching him on TV, Christian TV this evening, and I just heard him give this talk. It was something like Miracle of Endurance, or something like that. And I think there's a talk like that on YouTube, so it's probably the same one. And yeah, I enjoyed it. I was quite encouraged by it. And I think at the outset, he was kind of making this point. It's quite interesting that when we think of miracles, we think of maybe you're going to a Christian meeting and then they may be praying for people. Lots of people get saved, lives are changed. That's fantastic. And you get healings. So you get these particular kind of almost like instantaneous miracles or miracles that seem to happen as actual events. And that's great because we know when Jesus was walking the earth, he did miracles, didn't he? He healed people miraculously. And then even somebody like Zacchaeus, who was he was more than a tax collector, he was actually the chief tax collector. He turned to Jesus and then he said, I'll give half my goods a gift to the poor. And Zacchaeus had repented. And then, like with the Apostle Paul, he was dead against Christians. He wanted to do everything he could in his power to persecute Christians. And he was approving of the death of Stephen. Yet, Apostle Paul, he got converted. That was a miracle, wasn't it? Jesus appeared to him, and then he had a complete turnaround. He became very, instead of kind of zealous for the law against Christians, he became then very zealous for Christ and the work of the church and to see people saved. So that's like another maybe miracle that happened in terms of the conversion in a particular time. Although we know that Paul obviously spent sort of time with the Lord, wasn't it? It was at the time in Arabia, and obviously God would be working in Paul's life over a period of time. But you still have these sort of miracles which occur as actual events in an instance of time. Now, when Joel Osteen, and of course, those are great, Now, Joel Osteen, he was making the point that when we talk about miracles, we tend to think of those kinds of miracles. But he was also showing from the Bible, and we'll be having a look at some Bible verses. You've actually got the miracles of endurance. Now, sometimes you're in a situation where we would like God to deliver us out of that situation. We're praying for that, but sometimes God, he doesn't deliver us the way that we would like. We'd think of the miracle. Well, yeah, if God just sort of sorted that situation straight away, yeah, that's a miracle that I want, in that situation. But sometimes, and as we'll look at in the Bible, maybe people through kind of suffering endurance, they found that even though God didn't miraculously just change the situation for them overnight, over the period of time, the fact that they were able to endure, that was a miracle in itself, and that God actually kind of brought them through the situation. So even though things didn't happen the way they'd have liked, God still performed like an ongoing miracle to help them in that. So, excuse me, I'll just sitting up a bit better. And so the first example then, and Joel Osteen here referred, in fact, I'm trying to remember now, yeah, I think the examples I'm reading from in the Bible, I think those are the examples that Joel Osteen, that he talked about as well, and I found them a blessing. So the first instance is when the children of Israel, they were being led through the desert after leaving Egypt. And Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 5 says, and I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not waxen old upon you, and thy shoe is not waxen old upon thy feet. So it's like walking for 40 years through the wilderness, and the clothes didn't wear out, and the shoes kept them. So God, in that sort of situation, just miraculously kept them from day to day. So there's a miracle there that the shoes and clothes lasted 40 years. I mean, some of the clothes that I wear sometimes, they look like they're 40 years old. And I think I've got some things that I have had for maybe a few decades and stuff. I think this as well, I've had them for not quite 40 years, but it feels like it sometimes. Anyway, but shoes generally with me, they don't, it's usually a couple of years because things like heels and soles go. But their shoes and their clothes lasted 40 years in the wilderness. And they might be quite a rough terrain as well. So that's like the miracle of endurance, that God was with them and obviously feeding them with the manna. So obviously they'd have liked to have been overnight just in the promised land, but that didn't happen for a long time. But God just kept them, and He was working obviously in the situations over that time, but still miraculously providing for them. So that's the first example. And the second example was King David. He obviously had a sort of miracles when he defeated Goliath. And that was just like something that got, in a sense, I mean, I suppose he was prepared for it because he was familiar with using the sling. But he confessed, wasn't it, that God would sort of deliver Goliath into his hands. So it was still a miraculous deliverance for David. Even though he had his natural skills with the sling, God still gave David this miraculous victory over Goliath. But then a lot of David's life, he spent it, he was on the run from Saul because Saul was pursuing him. So a lot of David's life, it was hard going. And because we know that Saul was after him, there were a couple of times when David, he could have actually sort of killed Saul and just ended his problems there and then. But David had this endurance just to remain faithful, just to do what God wanted, even in the adversity. So the second passage I'd like to read 1 Samuel 24, verses 9 to 12. So I think that was just when they came out of I think Saul was hiding in the cave and David saw him, but Saul didn't see David, and David cut off part of his coat. So reading from verse 9, and David said to Saul, Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt? Asking the question, Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how the Lord hath delivered thee today into mine hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee, but mine eye spared thee. And I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe, and killed thee not. Know thou, and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand, and I have not sinned against thee, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. So God helped in this time of sort of difficulty, running from Saul and difficulty. God miraculously provided for David just to keep him, just to keep him safe, and also just to sort of help David to endure, to keep his eyes on God. Okay, so the third miracle of endurance was, now in one sense, it's still an example of God providing a miracle in an adverse situation. Now, this one probably wasn't over such a long period of time, but the third example is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they refused to bow before this sort of golden image, and they were being thrown into the furnace. Now, Joel Osteen was making the point that, yes, obviously because God is all-powerful, God could have changed the king's mind. God could have prevented them from going into the fire. But on this occasion, God chose to put them through the fire, but then make them fireproof. So I'm reading Daniel chapter 3, verses 22 to 30, and it says, so the king, he was angry, so he was going to throw Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego into the fire. And of course, it's interesting because just earlier on, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they said, yes, God, he is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So they're saying, yeah, God can deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down to worship that golden image. So reading from verse 22 then, it says, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, did we not cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. He answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth, and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth in the midst of the fire, and the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of the head singed, neither were their clothes changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel, and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve, nor worship any god, except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, that every people, nation, and language, which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And I don't think I'm going to have to try and pronounce their names anymore. I think that's me. But you can see the 3 people anyway, that God made good come out of it. Because Joel Osteen, he was making the point, because God's all powerful, he could have prevented them from going into the fire, but God chose to protect them, perform the miracles while they were in the fire, that the fire wouldn't hurt them. And then, of course, with the outcome, God was glorified, and then the king's, his heart changed afterwards, didn't he? He said that people, nations, and languages, if they spoke anything against God, that the houses might be made a dunghill, they'd be cut into pieces. So there was a good outcome then, that the king, he actually turned to God. Although he did, obviously Nebuchadnezzar, he did, hopefully there's still some good influence. But obviously we know that Nebuchadnezzar, he did have his ups and downs, didn't he? He did turn away, he did sort of like turn away from God, didn't he, Nebuchadnezzar? And yeah. So I was just looking at the Bible there. Yes. Yeah, I just couldn't quite remember the order. That we know that Nebuchadnezzar, he had his ups and downs, didn't he? Because he said, "Well, like this is my great kingdom. I've done all this," and then he had this sort of dream that he'd be put out until he sort of kind of turned back to God. So Nebuchadnezzar, he did have his ups and downs, but God was glorified in the situation with the fiery furnace. So I did enjoy Joel Osteen's message this evening, and that quite often we think of the miracles as the instantaneous events, or they happen as events, and that's great when it happens, but sometimes let's look for the miracle when we maybe pray for something, when we may be hoping that God might deliver us in a certain way. God might give us this turnaround the next day. If that doesn't happen, we can still maybe look for the miracle in God helping us in the situation. That's just as much of a miracle. So I trust this talk it's been an encouragement to you. And thanks for following me in this talk. And maybe if it's encouraged you, you might like to maybe share this video with some of your friends, just to encourage them. So yeah, thanks for following me in this talk, and God bless you.